begun to figure out how to do Zoom meetings. This is our second Zoom meeting. We actually had a Science Sunday a few days ago where we used this account and it seemed to work okay. So welcome everybody. I miss you. I miss all of you. I wish I were there to hug all of you and have a glass of wine and a nice conversation. But this is the way we have to meet each other for the time being. Some housekeeping things to take care of before we proceed with the speaker, our invited guest. One of the meetings we skipped in May is typically the time when we do our board elections.
Scott, can you speak louder, please?
Turn your volume up, Stephanie.
It's up as high as it'll go.
I can move closer to the microphone. How does it? Is that better? So here I am speaking.
It's worse.
Better.
It's worse.
Yeah.
Let me.
You became
Now.
much more tinny.
Is this better? I switched my.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes,
better.
now it's better for me too. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yep. So anyway, we skipped our May meeting, which is typically our election of word, and we thought that we could just do that today. You know, in past years, we've done it just by essentially unanimous consent. But if anybody has any objection to any of our proposed board members, we can certainly entertain that. Our board remains mostly unchanged, although there is one modification. Beth, after many years of service to our organization and many others, has decided to continue to join us as a guest, but no longer able or interested in serving as a board member. Beth, I don't want to speak for you. You can certainly tell me if I'm saying anything that doesn't sound right to you.
No, it sounds perfectly fine.
Okay. So we have solicited other potential board member candidates, and we have found Russell Keating, who's been a longtime member, waving at us there in chat. Russell, you want to say hello so your video pops up?
Unmute, please, Russell.
I was looking for the unmute button, but now I'm unmuted and I'm unstoppable. Hello, everyone.
Hey, Russell.
All right, I'll turn to the back.
Do people know that you can just hold down your space bar and it'll unmute you for the time you hold it down?
No, I didn't know that. Thank you.
And is there a way that you can increase the loudness similarly?
No, just on your computer on your end, Stephanie. We cannot control that through Zoom.
Okay.
That's why I use the earphones.
Yeah, you should be using headphones.
Right.
No, I can hear okay. It's just
Okay.
carry on.
Right. So so that was one change. Other than that, our board remains the same. It's Jack Seacrest, who was a co-founder of our group, Paul Selnow, who has been a longtime board member, Stephanie Downs-Hughes, who, Stephanie, I think you've been a member almost, if not since the beginning.
Right.
Deb Briggs is also a returning board member. Howard Katz is a board member and also a board member of the American Humanist Association. And Bonnie Chen has been a board member for the last, 3 years now, Bonnie, I think, and has been providing consistent, valuable input, as has everybody else. And I think that's it, except for myself. Did I miss anybody? I hope not.
No.
Okay. And then the other small change in the board is Jack is continuing to serve on the board as a board member, but he has asked to have somebody else step into the role of organization president or chairman. And according to our bylaws, the other board members have selected that I should be the current president of the organization. So I hope that I can fulfill that and keep you all happy and satisfied and educated and entertained, etc., as much as possible, especially during these challenging times. So that's our housekeeping stuff. I would ask now that if anybody has any objection to the roster of board members that I've mentioned, please let us know. Okay, then without dissent, I will assume now for the record that we have unanimous consent for the roster of board members previously mentioned.
Aye.
Good. All right. Thank you. So let's go ahead and proceed. I'm now going to turn the meeting over to Howard. He had a couple of items that he wanted to cover, as well as introducing our speaker.
Okay, thank you. A couple things. First of all, I'm not showing it on my, hang on a second, on my screen. One moment. Yoshi or Aura, are you here? Okay, I guess they're not here or haven't been here yet. They, Aura and Yoshi, who have been longtime chapter members, next Tuesday are moving to Nevada. And while they won't be able to come to meetings in general, they want to still keep in touch with everyone, and they wanted to say goodbye. So I'm sorry we're going to lose them, and I'm sorry they're not here to say goodbye. Hopefully they'll stop in a little bit. The next thing
Those are the Hosians.
Yes, thank you. Next thing I wanted to do is, as Scott mentioned, Beth Stoss has been a very long time and very dedicated member of our chapter. So the board thought that we would honor her. Let's see if I can get this working here. Okay. By doing a presentation to her. So this is what we've got, Beth. So presented to Beth Stoss in appreciation of her continuous work and dedication to our chapter and the Humanist movement, awarded June 2020 by the Humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland. And I hope you all join me in a round of applause to Beth.
Yay!
Hey, Beth.
You are absolutely wonderful in being so kind to honor me. I won't say recognize, but honor me in this regard. I think you all know that I wrote the newsletter for, I think, 15 years, and I've been on the board almost about that same length of time. And Deb Briggs said that she would do the newsletter, at least for the time being, and I believe Bonnie would take the treasurer's responsibility. So you should give them a round of applause too, because this should be ongoing. But I thank you all very much. And as a matter of very small correction, I will continue being a member of the Humanists. And there's a distinction between those who are attendees and who are members.
Well, you better continue to be a member.
Oh dear, what's that?
That's people, somebody who's not using headphones, or we're getting feedback.
Oh, okay.
So, okay. Does anybody have anything else they want to bring up before we move on to our presentation?
Oh, yes. I would like everyone to know that my Phyllis is back in the hospital.
Oh,
It's a kidney problem and an ongoing problem, so it's chronic. And she just had a little bit of surgery just an hour or so ago, is recovering, and hopefully she'll get out of the hospital in a couple of days. But this is, again.
We wish her well.
Yeah, send
Thank
her
you.
our best.
Right.
Healing
Yeah,
and
we-
vibes.
It will.
Best
It's
thoughts.
Yeah, with the present situation, no one can visit. So, I mean, I can't even visit. So,
Can you at least get online and wave at her?
Well, no, because they don't have anything. So the best I can do is her phone number. She's in room 5310 at Good Sam. So you can call her and razz her and just disturb her sleep. That's
Were you going to dictate her phone number to us?
yeah. It's 275-5310.
In area code 630?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. 275-5310. Thanks.
Correct. 5310.
And what room again was that?
5310.
Okay. Anybody have anything else at this point? Okay. I would like to, one word before I do the introduction for Rob. Please hold all questions until the end of his presentation. And when you do have a question, put your hand up. I'm really not that familiar with the part of Zoom where we can put the questions into queue. The chat function is available for people to use, but this way we can, put your hand up, we can see who you are and go through the questions that way. So is that agreeable to everybody?
Do you mean put our hand up like this?
Yes, so I can see your hand like I've been demonstrating right here. Yes, thank you, Joanne.
Because there's another way to do it, but
Yes, there is.
I understand. As I
Yeah.
just said, I'm not that familiar with it, so
that's
please
okay.
put your hand up.
Howard, I'd also request that people mute when the thing's going on so people aren't cutting in now.
Right, right. So while Rob's speaking, if everybody could mute themselves, that would probably be a good thing to do too. So, okay, here we go. Smile, Rob. You're going to be on in a moment. So, Rob Boston has been on the AHA Board of Directors since 2009. He's a senior advisor for Americans United for Separation of Church and State and the editor of AU's monthly magazine, Church and State. He's a prolific writer and researcher on church-state topics and an articulate advocate for the separation of church and state. He frequently writes about the political goals of the religious right and other church-state issues, such as religion in public schools, tax aid to sectarian education, and religious freedom. He's covered the U.S. Supreme Court for church and state and has attended numerous oral arguments in church-state cases at the High Court since 1988. You were 10 at the time, weren't you, Rob? Yeah, okay. Rob is the author of 4 books: Close Encounters with the Religious Right, Journeys into the Twilight Zone of Religious and Politics. Next one, The Most Dangerous Man in America, Pat Robertson and the Rise of the Christian Coalition. Why the Religious Right is Wrong About Separation of Church and State. And then Taking Liberties, Why Religious Freedom Doesn't Give the Right to Tell Other People What to Do. And most of these seem to be from Prometheus books. So with that, I will turn the floor over to our speaker tonight and my friend, Rob Boston.
Thank you, Howard, and thank you for having me this evening. It's a pleasure to be with you. What I'm going to do this evening is talk a little bit about some history, some current issues, and where we might have some work to do in safeguarding the separation of church and state, because unfortunately in this era, we do have a good bit of work to do. And then as Howard mentioned, when we're done, I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. Since I was a kid, I've been amused by a comment that the German philosopher Hegel once said. He said that history teaches us that we don't learn anything from history, which is kind of a cynical way of looking at things, and maybe a little more cynical than I would like to be, because I've always thought that our history is very important to us. It informs us, it helps us understand where we are today. So I think it is worthwhile to spend a little bit of time looking at some history. And when it comes to separation of church and state and religious freedom, we in this country actually have a very distinguished history, a reason to be proud. I mean, if you think about our origins, various settlements along the eastern coast, some in Virginia and some in Puritan Massachusetts and elsewhere, some of those founded for commercial reasons, others because people wanted to establish some type of a religious state. But you think about that situation and where we are today with so much diversity when it comes to religious and philosophical thought, thousands of different denominations, and of course, increasing numbers of people having no particular religious belief at all. It really is quite amazing. But as interesting as that history is and as instructive as it is, there have always been people who have resisted it. And they've come up with a counter narrative, the Christian nation myth. And I think it's important that we look at this myth and understand why it holds such power for people. You know, a historian's job, and I'm not a professional historian, I'm strictly an amateur, but anybody who reads history or enjoys history knows that their job is to pull the actual verifiable factual history from the myth. And not necessarily to discard the myth, but to ask why the myth has power and why people resonate to the myth. When it comes to the Christian nation myth, I like to think of it as a historical version of creationism. You know, you're probably all familiar with creationism, which is the religious rights explanation for how we got here. They reject evolution and they come up with this thing instead called creationism. Well, just as creationism is kind of false and uninteresting, the Christian nation myth is too, and it really denies the powerful story that we should be telling instead. Now, when we get to this issue of separation of church and state and religious freedom, the first thing we need to do is look at the text of our Constitution, because the Constitution is our governing document. Now, there are people who will sometimes look at other documents. You know, they'll look at the Declaration of Independence, which has several, you know, deistic references to the Creator and so on. But the Declaration, as important as it is and as powerful as it is and as eloquent as its language is not a governance document. It was written to announce that we were separating from Great Britain, sort of a press release to the world, if you will, saying that we were serious about wanting to be free. It is not a governance document. The Constitution is our governance document. And what does the Constitution say about Jesus Christ or Christianity or God? Well, it doesn't say anything about it. It's silent. Those words do not appear in the Constitution, nor do they appear in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that were appended shortly after the Constitution was ratified. And there's a reason for that, for our Constitution to be secular, to be silent on those things. I mean, this was debated, this was discussed, and there were people who really wanted our Constitution to extend some type of preference to Christianity or God or Jesus Christ, and that simply did not happen. As originally adopted, the Constitution said nothing about religious freedom. The only mention of religion was at the end of Article 6, which bars religious tests, that is, religious qualifications for federal office. So the Article 6 language says that you can't be required to be a Christian or a Protestant or a believer in order to hold federal office. And that in itself is a very telling statement. A nation that saw itself or wanted to be officially Christian would not have put a provision in its constitution guaranteeing Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, atheists, and others the right to hold office. But ours does that. So that's important. I mean, really, we shouldn't have to go much beyond that. When we hear from the Christian nation advocates, we really ought to be able to end the argument by saying, well, if you believe we're a Christian nation, could you just show me where that is in our Constitution? Because they can't do that. After the Constitution was ratified, the Bill of Rights was written, James Madison being the primary author of the Bill of Rights. His original proposal was for 20 amendments. Congress pared that down to 12. The first two didn't make the cut in the state. So what we know as the First Amendment was originally the Third Amendment. When those first two were rejected, Third Amendment became the First Amendment. And it begins with the words, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those are the religion clauses of the First Amendment. 16 words. Imagine today's Congress trying to encapsulate a fundamental human right in 16 words. That would be very challenging. I'm sure they couldn't do it. But our founders did. Well, where did they get that language? How did they come up with it? Well, their political experience was key to this discussion. You know, the founders didn't come out of a vacuum. Like anybody else, they grew up in a time, they lived through times, they had experiences, and they knew their history. The founders were keenly aware of the centuries-long union of church and state in Europe and how that had crushed human freedom, how that combination of religion and government in those countries hadn't made people free. And they wanted a conscious break with that. They'd also seen examples of that type of oppression in our own country. I mean, think about the Puritans in Massachusetts who came here for religious freedom for themselves. They didn't extend it to others. And some of the colonies like Virginia and the Carolinas, you had an established church that was Anglican. In some of the New England states, you had the Congregational Church, which was the old Puritan church. being established by law. So you had all these different situations, and the framers were really saying at the federal level, at least, you weren't going to have any type of official established church. Now, Thomas Jefferson, as early as 1776, was pushing for the end of the established church in Virginia. He wrote a religious freedom bill that would disestablish the Anglican Church and give everybody the right to choose their own faith. But he was a little bit ahead of his time. 1776, if you remember your history, there were some other things going on back then at that time. So the bill didn't really go anywhere. But after the Revolution, the question came up again. How should religion and government be ordered in Virginia? Should there be any official relationship? Well, Jefferson was living in time in Paris. He was our ambassador to France, so he wasn't on the scene. But his friend and protege, James Madison, was. And James Madison was a strong advocate for separation of church and state. Now, Patrick Henry, somebody you may be familiar with, the patriot who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," wanted to tax everybody in Virginia to pay for some version of Christianity. Now, Patrick Henry probably thought that that was actually a more progressive way to do things, because you would go from one officially established church, Anglicanism, to lots of different Christian churches being established, and you could choose the one you wanted. So you'd have freedom of choice as long as it was a Christian church. Well, even that was too much for Madison. He knew that was not true freedom. So Madison wrote a very powerful document in 1785 called the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. It's a list of 15 reasons why nobody should be taxed to pay for religion. It's a very powerful document, and it had the intended effect. Henry's bill was defeated, and then Madison pushed Thomas Jefferson's religious freedom bill through the legislature. The Anglican Church was disestablished in Virginia, and everybody had the right to choose their own religion, a remarkable accomplishment. Madison took those values with him when the First Amendment was written, when the Constitution was written, and then the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights a little bit after that. So Madison and Jefferson really are key to the story. And of course, we must remember not to deify the framers. They were very far-sighted in some areas like religious freedom, but in their other areas like their embrace of slavery, the subjugation of women, the fact that they created a power structure that put all the power in the hands of rich white landowners. We know that that was not far-sighted, not progressive. But they also gave us a constitution that can be changed, and over the years, it has been. Now, sometimes people ask, well, what about that famous phrase, the wall of separation between church and state? Where did that come from? Well, that comes from the writings of Jefferson. Jefferson was president. He was elected in 1800. In 1801, in the fall of 1801, he received a letter from some Baptists in Connecticut who wrote to tell him that they appreciated his understanding of religious freedom because they were living under a congregational establishment. They were forced to support the congregational church, even though they didn't belong to it, even though they didn't agree with it. They wanted Jefferson's view of religious freedom to be spread throughout the land, because remember, at this time, the First Amendment applied only to the federal government. It didn't apply to the states. So the states were free to keep their established religions, and some did. In his response to these Baptists, which Jefferson penned on New Year's Day, 1802, he wrote back and he agreed with them, and he invoked that metaphor of the First Amendment erecting a wall of separation between church and state. So that's where that comes from. And it has been a powerful metaphor that has come down to us through the years. Jefferson and Madison and other founders who advocated for religious freedom did not fight this battle alone. They had allies in the clergy. John Leland was a Baptist minister, a native of Massachusetts who lived for a while in Virginia. He was a friend of Thomas Jefferson's, and he was a strong advocate for religious freedom for all, even though he was a very devout Christian himself. John Leland once said, "The notion of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever." He did not believe the government should be involved in these matters, and he advocated strongly for religious freedom in Virginia. Then he moved back to Massachusetts, helped disestablish the state church there, which occurred in 1833, and he helped people in Connecticut do it as well. So these strong clerical allies joined with Enlightenment thinkers like Jefferson and Madison and others to create this idea of separation of church and state. That's a little bit about founders' political beliefs. What about their religious beliefs? Would the founders have supported an officially Christian nation because that's what they advocated for personally due to their religious beliefs? Well, there certainly were some founders back then who thought that way. I talked about Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry, as strong as his words were about individual freedom, was a theocrat, and all of his life advocated for Christianity being merged with the government. But his view did not carry the day. Instead, you had the Enlightenment thinkers, or Christian rationalists, as some of them have been called, or deists, coming out of the Enlightenment, arguing for complete conscience, liberty of conscience for all. It's very interesting. If you actually look at some of the things the founders said about Christianity and religion, it's kind of shocking to today's ears because they were very deistic in their approach. Thomas Jefferson, for example, admired Jesus as a moral teacher and really thought that his moral teachings were sublime, but didn't believe in any of the miracle stories of the New Testament or the claims to Christ being divine. In fact, Jefferson took a knife and cut up the New Testament. He pasted up everything he accepted and discarded the rest. And the parts that he discarded were the stories of Jesus's miracles, his claims to divinity, the Trinity, references to the Trinity, and so forth. Jefferson's Jesus is a very human figure, more like a moral philosopher than the Son of God. And that devotional that Jefferson made for himself, never intending for it to become public, was called The Life and Morals of Jesus Christ. It did become public and has been published since. It's called the Jefferson Bible. So Jefferson, being very strong on his beliefs, clearly not a conventional Christian. Once he wrote to John Adams, one of my favorite quote of his, he said, "The day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus by the Supreme Being, as his father in the womb of a virgin, will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva springing from the brain of Jupiter." So Jefferson clearly did not believe in revealed Christian doctrine. John Adams was a Unitarian who rejected the notion of the Trinity, which he considered to be nonsensical. George Washington held to a very social utilitarian view of religion, holding that religion was important for people's moral behavior, but didn't seem to be a Christian and often spoke of God in very deistic terms. The supreme architect of the universe was a term that he preferred to use. Perhaps the most enigmatic founder of all was Madison. We don't know much about his religious views. As a young man, he had a very brief period of intense religiosity where he even considered becoming a clergyman, but it passed. And after that, he never really discussed the issue. Unlike some other founders who talked about their religious beliefs in letters or in speeches, Madison never really did. So we're not quite sure where he stood. He was nominally an Anglican, but certainly not the kind of devout Christian that a lot of people would claim that he was on the religious right today. So the political beliefs of the founders, the religious beliefs of the founders would not have led them to create a Christian nation. The Constitution that they did give us, the secular Constitution that guarantees religious freedom for all, that bars religious tests, that angered a lot of extremely conservative clergy of the day. They were offended that there was no reference to Christianity or God or Jesus Christ in the Constitution, and they wanted to change that. First thing they did was, well, they attacked the Constitution after it was ratified in sermons. You can go back and read some of these early 19th century sermons where pastors would fulminate from the pulpit that because we had rejected the Christian God, our nation would never be able to stand the test of time. One pastor said in a sermon, his name was John Mason, that the lack of references to God in the Constitution was, quote, an omission which no pretext whatever can palliate. He said that God's justice would rain down on us and overturn our nation from its foundations. Well, this was a very common view at the time. These folks knew that we didn't have a Christian government. They knew we didn't have a Christian constitution. They wanted to change that. And in fact, they tried. Jump ahead a little bit to the post-Civil War era, late 19th century. A group came along called the National Reform Association. This was an early religious right organization, a pressure group of extremely conservative Christian ministers that wanted to change the Constitution. They had other agendas too. They wanted to establish a national law requiring that there be no work or labor on Sunday. They wanted there to be widespread censorship of any material that they considered to be blasphemous or offensive to Christianity. And they generally wanted there to be a Christian cast to as many laws as possible. But one of the things they really wanted to do was rewrite the preamble to the Constitution to add explicit references to Jesus Christ, Christianity, and God. Now, if our Constitution had established an officially Christian state, they wouldn't have had to do that. But they knew it did not. So they pushed for this change. Now, we know it didn't pass, but it was debated. It was first proposed in 1864. It was debated in 1874, where it failed in the House Judiciary Committee. It was reintroduced in 1882. And then get this, it resurfaced again in 1961, 1963, and 1965. Now, as I said, this didn't pass. But the fact that it was tried so often was evidence that the religious right was trying to basically add these references after the fact. So that's the origin, actually, of the Christian nation myth. You know, people sometimes ask me, well, how did this get started? When did people start believing this? It's not something the founders ever embraced. We know that from what I said earlier. Their political beliefs, their religious beliefs did not lead them in that direction. Where did it come from? Well, late 19th century. Think about this, post-Civil War era, a very confused time. The country had been through this incredibly traumatic civil war. Tens of thousands of people were dead. One region of the country set against another, massive destruction of the infrastructure, cities burned to the ground. Whenever you have this kind of chaotic, confusing period, some people inevitably seek comfort in extremely conservative forms of religion. And that's kind of what happened at that time too. Some people began to really just embrace this idea that we had been punished, that the Civil War was in fact a form of God's judgment, that he was angry at us because we had not recognized him in our Constitution and did not recognize him. So he sort of smote us with this terrible war. And there were people who said that the way to change that was to get more references to him, not just in the Constitution, but in public life. That the phrase "in God we trust" that you see on money now, that actually first started to appear on coins in the North during the Civil War. And it was the recommendation of a Protestant minister in Pennsylvania who lobbied the government, the federal government, to argue that if we got some reference to God in our money, we could appease this vengeful deity. And that's when that first started to happen. So that's a little bit about the myth's origins, coming out of this very confused and chaotic period. Why does it continue to have a hold on people today? Well, I think it has a hold because it feeds a number of beliefs that are common among Christian nationalists, or the religious right, if you will. And the first is that we are naturally a good and decent nation that's especially loved by God. Now, if you think about that for a minute, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Yes, our nation has done many good things, but we obviously have had a lot of problems in the past. We tolerated slavery. We treated people of minority races abominably. We denied them their right to vote, to live where they wanted. We treated individuals of religious minorities very poorly. We disenfranchised them too. We chased the Native Americans off their land and put them into squalid reservations. I mean, obviously we have a lot of things we need to face up to in our past, and an honest historian is capable of looking at that and facing it. Well, a lot of folks in Christian nationalism don't want to do that. They want to believe that our nation has always been good because God loves us more than any other country. So we must be good and we must be in a Christian nation. That's the first reason. The second reason is the Christian nation myth feeds a sort of somewhat paranoid belief on the far right that something has been taken from them. Their legacy has been stolen. That we had this wonderful Christian nation, and it was taken away by secular humanists, anti-God people, whoever the enemy du jour is. So it feeds that belief, that persecution narrative that you hear so much of out of the religious right these days. It also provides comfort for those who fear social change. Think about what's happened in this country in the past 50 or 60 years. We had a succession of rights movements. The passage of the 14th Amendment in the post-Civil War era was designed to apply the Bill of Rights to the states, making sure that states could not take away your fundamental rights, just as the federal government could not as well. Now, the Supreme Court resisted that, but finally in the early 20th century, they made it clear that, yes, that's what the 14th Amendment does. And that opened up the door to lots of rights movements, civil rights movement, women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, and now non-believer rights movements. And to some people, these rights movements they've been scary. I mean, most of us look at that and we're happy. We see an America that is trying to embrace and welcome more people. And recent events have certainly taught us that we still have a long way to go in some areas. But at least we have a law and a mechanism now that enables people to go to court and advocate for their rights. But that frightened a lot of folks on the ultra-conservative religious right spectrum, and they embraced the Christian nation myth even tighter as a way of dealing with the uncertainty and even fear that they felt. The Christian nation myth is also a means to political power for some people. Politicians, even some who aren't particularly religious themselves, not like I'm naming any names, can use the Christian nation myth to advocate that segment of the voters that very strongly believe in that, get them to the polls and create political change. This type of revisionism, Christian nation myth, also leads people to believe that, they have access to a secret type of knowledge that's been denied anybody else. It's almost a conspiracy theory. Well, I know the real story of what happened with our country. And here again, you get that parallel with creationism. The creationists are always arguing, well, you can believe that evolution stuff if you will, but, I know what really happened. And I know that Noah's Ark is an actual factual story. And I know that the earth is only 6,000 years old. Mainstream scientists don't want you to know about that. They're suppressing the evidence. Just like those mainstream historians are trying to hide the glorious fact of our Christian nation. So it leads people to believe that they know more than specialists. They know more than the elites. So it feeds that too. So that's some history about where we have been, why people embrace some of these things. Where are we now? Well, unfortunately, we're not in a very good place. The 2016 election was a pivotal election. We had a vacancy on the Supreme Court. We had vacancies on lower courts, and we know what happened there. As a result, we have a government that is running the country mainly through regulatory changes and executive orders. Congress is divided right now. Republicans control the Senate, Democrats control the House. There's not a lot of legislation being passed. But the administration has changed a lot of things simply by making regulatory changes in the federal agencies and by the passage of executive orders. So things like birth control access, which was something we thought we had nailed down back in the 1960s, is suddenly on the table again. And groups are refusing to abide by the birth control mandate that's found in the Affordable Care Act. Lgbt rights were on the upswing. 2015, we saw the Supreme Court uphold marriage equality. Since then, we've started to lose ground. There have been executive orders that have banned transgender troops from the military and other types of regulatory changes that have eroded LGBTQ rights. We have a definition of religious freedom being put before us that allows people to use religious freedom as an instrument of discrimination or to take away the rights of others. For-profit secular businesses arguing that they should have the right to refuse service to people who offend their religious beliefs. This is modern day Jim Crow. Think about the 1960s and the 50s when Jim Crow was in effect in the South. Some business owners said to African Americans, well, I'm not going to let you stay at my hotel. I'm not going to let you eat at my restaurant. Your presence offends me. Now we have people saying the same thing to members of the LGBTQ community and saying they have a religious freedom right to discriminate. Now, make no mistake, houses of worship do have that right to discriminate. A Catholic church doesn't have to let you come in, or a Protestant church, or a synagogue, or a temple. They don't have to let you in there if they don't like you, or that you're the wrong religion. But these are not churches we're talking about. These are for-profit secular businesses, bakers, photographers, wedding industry folks, people who make wedding invitations, people who plan weddings. Even the owners of B&Bs and small hotels are now arguing they can refuse to serve people if they find their behavior offensive. We've had an administration that has embraced the display of Christian symbols on public property. There was a case a couple of years ago involving the display of a giant cross not too far from where I live in Bladensburg, Maryland. This cross was erected in the early 20th century, and it was described as a war memorial for people who had fought in World War I. But you know what? It didn't memorialize all those troops. It memorialized the Christians. A cross is the central symbol of the Christian faith. It is not a generic symbol of sacrifice for everybody. Yet the government, the Supreme Court, allowed that to stand in a public park because it had been there a long time. So basically they argued a constitutional violation kind of gets grandfathered in over time. Very shocking. We've had a very, very difficult time with the question of government and tax aid flowing to religious institutions, including private schools through voucher plans. And even right now, in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, the relief package that was passed allows the government to pay the salaries of clergy. This is the first time that this has been done at the federal level in our history. States had done it back when they had established churches, but that all died away in 1833. Here we have the federal government paying the salaries of clergy for the first time in our history. It's shocking. And it's very difficult to challenge it in court right now, given the makeup of the Supreme Court, which is so conservative. Religious right organizations are empowered. They've been in court. They've been pushing their agenda. They're getting friendlier reception in the courts because of the way the courts have been remade over the past 4 years. Now, one thing did happen recently that I think was a positive thing, kind of surprising, and that was some of these houses of worship were arguing that they should have the right to stay open and have in-person services during the pandemic, even though secular gatherings had been banned. So you couldn't go to a baseball game, you couldn't go to a rock concert, you couldn't go to a lecture, and you couldn't go to a house of worship. Everybody was treated equally. Religious groups were not singled out for bad treatment. They were simply told, you can't meet, and none of these other types of entities can meet either. While some of these religious groups argued that they should have the right to meet anyway. The Supreme Court,
Just listening.
a few days ago, ruling 5-4, did say that government officials have the right to impose neutral orders on religious and secular entities alike. Chief Justice John Roberts swung over with the liberal bloc and voted that way. I mean, it was a 5-4 decision, which is kind of scary because this is a bit of a no-brainer. We're trying to contain a pandemic here. And some of these groups were saying they should have the right to meet anyway. So that's where we are a little bit right now. A very difficult time, a very challenging time. A time when we see a lot of things that we took for granted in separation of church and state being challenged, being eroded, being attacked, being undermined. So we have a lot of work to do. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about where we really would like things to be. And now, as I say this to you, as I lay out this agenda, I want you to know that this is a long-term project. It's ambitious. And I want you to work for it, but I also want you to understand that the work you do may not pay off until the next generation, until you're gone, to be frank. But you still need to do it too, because it is important that we work toward this freedom for the next generation, not just for ourselves, but for those who are going to be coming along. It is important that we understand that the freedom granted us in the First Amendment, in the Bill of Rights, is under assault, and we need to shore it up. So the first thing we need really is just a full implementation of church-state separation, and that includes equality for non-believers to be treated equally, legally, alongside believers, and for the culture to understand that this is how it is meant to be. Right now, we have a system that in many cases favors the believer. And sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's not. We really need to move toward a system of true neutrality where the government doesn't have an opinion on religion. Now, I'm not talking about a state that is hostile to religion like you would find in, say, former Soviet Russia or China today or North Korea. We don't want that. We want a government that is neutral on religion, a government that simply says, look, when it comes to religion, believe or don't believe what you want, we don't have an opinion. We don't have a favorite church. We don't have a favorite religious expression. That's the first step. The second thing I think we need is for religious believers to just take a second and acknowledge how good their position is, that they do live in a position of preference or privilege. Now, they resist that. Some on the right do. You'll hear religious leaders on the religious right argue that they're being persecuted or somehow their rights are being squashed. And that's far from the truth. Think about some examples. Tax exemption is one. Religious organizations receive tax exemption by mere dint of their existence. They don't have to apply for it. Now, if we get together and we decide we want to form a group to say, work on climate change or racial justice or women's rights or LGBTQ rights or whatever it might be, we have to apply for tax exemption. We have to show that we deserve it. And if we don't make the case, we won't get it. But a house of worship doesn't have to do any of that. No paperwork. They get it as soon as they form. Of course, we know they are exempt from a lot of the rules that the IRS imposes on secular nonprofits, like lobbying. Sometimes people ask me, how much money does the Catholic Church spend on lobbying in Washington, D.C., or the Mormons or some other denomination? And the answer is nobody knows because they are not required to tell us. Now, at Americans United, we lobby and we are required to fill out forms 4 times a year. And we're only allowed to spend a certain percentage of our budget on lobbying. If we go over that percentage by even 1%, we're going to get a fine. Not so with houses of worship and religious groups. They are exempt from any reporting requirement. Nobody knows what they're spending. Some states have laws that do require religious groups to report the money they spend on lobbying at the state level, but only a few. California is one. In 2008, California had a referendum on same-sex marriage. It came to light that the Mormon Church had spent $40 million on that referendum. The only reason we know that is because California had a law requiring disclosure. Most states don't, so you don't know what they're spending. It wouldn't hurt for them to be a little more transparent. They're trying to pass laws that affect all of us. I think we have the right to know about that. They're not required to do any financial reporting, houses of worship. You hear about these TV preachers who have 16 houses and jets to fly them all over the world and take vacations and are always spending money on this high lifestyle. How do they get away with it? Well, they're not required to tell anybody what they're doing with their money. So the money that they collect basically falls into their black hole. There's no reporting requirements. There is no effort to have accountability. Again, Americans United and other nonprofits, we have to fill out a detailed financial form every year and file it with the IRS. It's called a 990. You can look at it online. You see how much money we raised, how we spent it, even top salaries. There's accountability for secular nonprofits. There's none for religious groups. Religious groups routinely get exemptions from laws that are passed. That's just what now, and I'm not saying all of those exemptions are bad. Some may be in fact required, but they get it because their position is one of privilege. They need to stop complaining that they're being persecuted. The position of religion is privileged, not persecuted. Next thing they need to do, they need to stop trying to force us to live under their theology. If they want us to adopt their theology, they can persuade us. Religious right organizations, and I've been to some of their meetings over the years, I hear fundamentalist Christians talk all the time about how great and wonderful their religious system is. Their walk with Christ, it's made them so peaceful, so happy, great, good for them. But not everybody feels that way. Not everybody embraces that same faith system. We have the right to question it and to say that we don't believe it and to reject it. Frankly, from where I'm sitting and as I've observed right-wing Christianity in this country over the past 33 years, what I'm finding is a system that's often based on hate and fear and division and conspiracy theories. It's not that attractive, frankly. So having failed to persuade us to adopt it, they have no right to employ the engine of the state to force us. They need to stop trying to shut down modern science. That's the next thing we need to work toward, boosting the role of science in the society. Certainly right now, as we're in the midst of this global pandemic, we can see even more the need for policies based on science and the scientific method. Yet, we've had this resistance from so many on the far religious right because they believe not in science, but their particular narrow brand of Christianity. There were people who argued, who were meeting in houses of worship unlawfully during the shutdown in many states, who would argue, I saw one woman on CNN, she said, well, I don't worry because I'm covered in Jesus's blood. Now, I don't know that there have been any double-blind studies about the effectiveness of Jesus's blood in combating the coronavirus. But I do know that there's been a lot of study about how that thing is spread. And they know that houses of worship with a lot of communal behavior and shared implements were vectors for the spread. And that's why they ordered that they be shut down alongside secular meetings. The attack on evolution I mentioned earlier, the attack on climate change and so much of the modern science that defined our world, they have rejected that, and we have the right to stand up and to say no. Science is not just another way of knowing. It is something that operates under the scientific method, and it is open to correction if you can prove that what has been done is inaccurate. So there's a self-correcting mechanism there that you don't see in religion. So religious folks need to understand that while they're, I understand their beliefs are important to them, they don't get the trump science. They need to understand, and we need to work on the complete secularization of our public schools. Now, you might think, well, isn't that already the case? Well, it really depends on where you live. If any of you look at the materials put out by Americans United or groups like the Freedom from Religious Foundation or the American Humanist Association or American Atheists, you will see that we are constantly fighting in some parts of the country to keep inappropriate forms of religious expression out of the public schools, the teaching of creationism, prayer at school events. I mean, things that the Supreme Court struck down many decades ago still happen in some parts of the country. Now, I want to be clear. Students have the right to pray on their own if they want to. I don't mind that at all. If a student wants to say a prayer before he or she eats lunch or takes a test, that's fine, done in a non-disruptive manner, something that they're truly choosing to do. If a young person would like to read a Bible or the Quran or Scientology book or some other religious tome, if they have some free time during the school day, again, no problem with that. What I'm objecting to is the school having any kind of official or coercive religious event and compelling or pressuring students to take part. And believe me, that does still happen. So we really need to work very strongly on getting our public schools completely and utterly secularized. They could still teach about religion as an academic subject, but they could not preach religion. That's the difference. Next thing we need to work on is making sure that religious organizations pay for all their own stuff. There has been great erosion in this principle. If we had a time machine, we'd go back to the 1970s. That was really the high water mark of church-state separation in the United States. We had rulings from the Supreme Court striking down voucher plans. We had rulings from the Supreme Court striking down other types of aid to religious institutions. And that has all been eroded because of conservative appointments to the Supreme Court and lower federal courts. And now we have a situation where not only voucher plans have been upheld by the Supreme Court, but the court might actually rule later this month that under certain conditions, state governments can be compelled to support religious schools. There's a case before the Supreme Court where they might actually say that. It is remarkable. This is going to take a lot of work to get things back to where they need to be, but we absolutely have to do this because 90% of our children in this country, 90% attend public schools. Yet we keep siphoning that money away, and it's not finite. I mean, there's not infinite. It's only a limited amount of money available for the schools. Siphoning that away to private religious schools that discriminate, that teach creationism in many cases, that proselytize, and quite frankly, some of them, they don't even offer a very good education. And if you're not learning basic science in a fundamentalist Christian academy, and you're not, imagine what that does to a young person. Imagine what type of a disadvantage that puts him or her at. You get into a college, first day in biology class, you don't know a darn thing about evolution, you're going to be behind. So those schools, don't get the wrong idea, they have the right to exist. They do not have the right to demand that you and I subsidize them, which is exactly what's happening right now. We need religious organizations, and we need to be working on the idea that everybody has to follow certain secular laws. Remember a couple years ago in Kentucky, there was this woman named Kim Davis. She was a government official. She worked for a county in Kentucky. She refused to give marriage licenses to same-sex couples, even though the Supreme Court had said marriage equality was the law of the land. You just can't do that. Certainly not a government official. Certainly not someone who's employed by the county or the taxpayers. You need to do your job. And if you can't, if you find that you absolutely cannot do your job, then you need to resign. But she didn't want to do that. She wanted to keep her well-paid government job and discriminate on the grounds of religion. And that simply cannot be permitted. Nor can it be permitted, I would argue, at secular for-profit businesses. As I said earlier, religious organizations, houses of worship, they do have the right to discriminate. Secular for-profit businesses do not. Next thing we need to be working on, getting across the idea that religious organizations need to display their religious symbols on their own time with their own dime. Get those off public property. Giant towering crosses do not belong in front of City Hall. They do not belong in public park. They belong on church lawns and other private places. A cross, as I said earlier, is the central symbol of the Christian faith. It does not represent us all. Certainly it is inappropriate for a war memorial. If we're going to memorialize our veterans, let's make sure we include them all by having secular symbols up there. Yet we are fighting that all over the country now because of this misguided ruling from the Supreme Court. We also need to defend some very basic terms. Secular, secularism, those are not dirty words. Those are good features of government. And we need to make that clear to people. The religious right has successfully tarred the secular state as a state that's hostile to religion. But as I've already mentioned, that's not the case. That's not what secularism is. Secularism is something that protects our religious beliefs and our right to not be religious. So let's make sure people understand the importance of the secular state. And the last thing we need to work on, and then I'm going to wrap up, is we need people to realize in this country that a lot of the things that they see every day that are religious in nature, and they may consider harmless, are not viewed that way by a growing number of people in this country. What I mean by that is this: if you reach into your pocket or your wallet and you pull out a quarter or a dollar, you're going to see "In God We Trust" embossed on that piece of currency. When you say the Pledge of Allegiance, it includes the phrase "under God." When you read our national motto, you see "In God We Trust." These are what's called civil religion. These things, they do not go back to the founding period. The founders did not come up with these things. They spring from, in most cases, the 1950s. During our nation's epic struggle with so-called godless communism, we wanted to distinguish ourselves from that country, so we embraced these civil religion ideas. In God We Trust, which I mentioned had been appearing on coins sporadically since the Civil War, was codified for use on all currency in the 1950s. Under God was slipped into the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. The Pledge of Allegiance, as originally written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy, a Christian minister and a socialist to boot, did not contain that phrase "under God." It was put in there in the 1950s after a lobbying campaign led by the Knights of Columbus. And the motto, "In God We Trust," was officially adopted in the 1950s as well. Before that, we didn't have an official national motto. We unofficially were using E Pluribus Unum. Now we have an official motto, and it's "In God We Trust." These things are offensive to a lot of us. Think about it for a minute. In God we trust. What does that say? That's not a statement of neutrality. That's the state saying there's one God, not 5 gods, not 20 gods, not no God. There's one God. You should trust in that God. That's what real Americans do. That's what good Americans do. And if you don't, maybe you're a second-class citizen. Maybe we don't think as well of you. So even that phrase, which a lot of people think, oh, it's benign, it's harmless, it doesn't really have religious meaning anymore. Of course it has religious meaning. It's expressing a national belief in one deity. It is designed to make a religious statement. And I don't think the courts are in any way ready for serious challenges to these things. It's been tried and they've all failed. But we have to work to educate people about why they're offensive and look toward the day when we can make a change on how the courts view these things. I want to wrap up by just saying a couple things about the agenda that I've outlined, and people often say to me, well, that's very ambitious, can we get there? Well, as I said a few moments ago, it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take an understanding on the part of a lot of people that it's a long-term project. But think about that for a minute. All of the rights movements in this country have been long-term projects. When African Americans began advocating for civil rights, that didn't happen overnight. And we all know what the advocates of that point of view went through. They were beaten, had dogs set on them, water cannons, thrown in jail for no reason, assassinated, beaten up. But they eventually prevailed. And even though, of course, as we know, some recent events have shown there's still a lot of work to do in this area. When women began advocating for the right to vote, they didn't get that right away. They didn't just give up. No, they kept at it, and they fought, and they secured that right, and then they secured other rights as well. When LGBTQ individuals began to push for their rights, there was great resistance. And the vast majority of people in this country were not in favor of that. But they pressed on, and little by little, they also won rights, culminating with the right to marry at the Supreme Court in 2015. And now, if you look at the polling data on that question, vast majority of people are in favor. So as you push for these rights, you also sometimes can change what's in the hearts of people. So you must keep your eye on that, understand it is a long game, work very hard on it, and understand that the payoff may not come until you're gone. Now, that thing about you being gone, I don't want to dwell on that because we don't like to think about that. But I'm here to tell you today, and this may be a surprise to some of you, that there is an afterlife. Now, you're probably surprised to hear that because we're humanists and we don't believe in an afterlife. There is an afterlife in the sense that after you're gone, after your life, there will be people who will remember you. I don't know how many people it will be. It may be a small group, it may be a large group, but they'll remember you and they'll speak of you sometimes. What do you want them to say? How do you want them to remember you? Oh, well, there was an election and it didn't go the way we liked, so he disengaged. She was worried because people were saying a lot of nasty, unpleasant things about her, so she pulled back. He got tired. He stopped fighting. No, that's not what you want people to say. What you want people to say is, he always fought for what he thought was right. She stood up every time. You never had to doubt where she stood on an issue. She was out there on the front lines every day. He may not have had a lot of money, but he supported causes he believed in. She may not have had a lot of time, but she got out there and went to marches and fought and did other things. Those are the types of activities. Those are the types of things that you want people to say. and how you want people to remember you. And I'm not saying you have to fight every battle or you have to do everything, because believe me, you'll get burned out if you do. Decide what your comfort level is and proceed from there. Everybody has to think of these things for themselves. But when you get discouraged, just remember that we have had significant victories in many areas over the years, despite the attempts to roll them back. And we can continue to have victories if we continue to fight. It's not always going to be an easy fight. It's not always going to be pleasant. And I don't like that word fight. I'd rather people get along. But the fact is, we have a segment of our population today that has embraced theocracy. I mean that. They really would like for there to be a Christian state, an official Christian state, as they define that term. And that is a Christian state that would exclude, in fact, millions of Christians. They're out there, they're advocating, they're funding their beliefs, they're pushing. We have to get out there too. And I would say to you that that really is the best legacy that you can leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was great.
So we have questions? I see we have some chat. But,
yeah, we've got some chat. So if you've got a question, you can either type it now into chat, or you can raise your hand. And right now I see Howard with his hand raised. Howard, you have a question?
Yeah, actually, two things, both of them both unrelated to each other. But Rob, first of all, you were talking about the case that may be decided either this month or next month about the state support of, state supporting
religious schools. Yeah.
Right. Is the way I've been reading that, see if you agree, it looks like Roberts might end up actually being a swing vote on that one.
I don't hold out a lot of hope for that. Roberts has never been a dependable vote on questions of funding. I mean, he has come around on a couple things. You may remember that he provided a decisive vote upholding Obamacare, and then this most recent ruling where he ruled with the liberals on church closings and so on. But on questions of funding, he really has embraced this idea that's very common among conservatives these days, that if the government is supporting secular institutions, they may be required under certain conditions to support religious ones as well. So I don't have much hope that case is going to come down in a favorable way. The question is, how much damage will they do? They could either do a little bit or they could do a whole lot.
My second part, and by the way, don't forget he also came down on our side when it came to same-sex marriage, which was surprising.
Yeah.
So you mentioned your interfacing quite a bit, or at least on and off, with creationists. I kind of wonder what kind of interfacing or experience have you had with flat earthers, and how do they fit into the picture?
Oh man. Well, Howard, actually, I want to correct one thing. I don't think Roberts ruled the right way on same-sex marriage.
I thought he did.
Kennedy did. Kennedy was still.
Oh, okay.
Roberts did not.
Sorry.
Flat earthers, yes. We actually have had a run-in with them a couple years ago. It was actually kind of funny. There's a group out there I can't remember the name of it, but it's run by this extremely conservative Catholic man who believes that Galileo was wrong. Remember Galileo's epic clash with the Catholic Church? Well, he thinks the church originally stated back then, was right. It wasn't so much he believes in the flat earth. He believes Earth is the center of the universe, and the earth does not move. Everything moves around the earth. And they made this documentary about this. It's called Geocentrism.
And they have a website, by the way.
Yes, they do. And they actually somehow tricked the actress Kate Mulgrew, who played Captain Janeway on one of the Star Trek shows. They tricked her into narrating part of this documentary. I don't think they told her that it was a geocentrist documentary. They just offered her a check. And this came out, and it made a bit of a splash. So we did some writing about that and pointing that out. And I've had some fun poking fun at the flat earthers since then too. But the fact that there are still people in this day and age who embrace these ideas, I mean, it's quite remarkable. But it just goes to show you how warped some thinking can be from extreme religious fundamentalism.
All right. We had a question from Stephanie.
Yeah, I've got a two-parter too. I loved hearing the history of how there were advocates for marrying government and church early on and how long that went. When I was a little kid, I knew the term anti-disestablishmentarianism because it was supposedly the longest word in the English language, but I never knew what it meant. But I think right now we are for disestablishment. And so the anti-disestablishmentarianism movement were the bad guys.
Yeah.
Is that right, Rob?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Yes, yes.
Okay. Number two, you were talking about how important it is to preserve the word secular for being the good guys and stuff. I think we need to do that with humanism too. People are confused about what humanism means. Is it something in literature, a kind of literature? What do you think about that term?
Yes, I think we could do a better job explaining that. People confuse it sometimes with humanities, you know, the college level discussion of English literature and other things like that. And to the extent that people do know what it is, they may have a misinformed notion because it's been so distorted by religious right groups. Remember how in the 80s they were always talking about how secular humanism was this
secular humanists,
bogeyman coming to get you. So we could do a little bit of a better job. And I know that there are people out there who have struggled with what terms to use to describe this movement, and different things have been floated over the years. And obviously I'm on the board of the AHA alongside Howard, so I gravitate toward humanism. But I just think one of the most important things we can do, no matter what you call yourself, humanist, atheist, agnostic, freethinker, is just to let people know that lack of religious belief does not equate amorality. Does that mean you have no morals? I mean, you'd be amazed how many people think that. So
and we're also the fastest growing religious category, the non-believers.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Nuns, anyway. I mean, whether all those nuns are non-believers is pulling data kind of points in different directions, but certainly that is a large population, segment of the population right now.
Thanks.
All right. Joanne, you had a question? You want to take yourself off mute there?
Yeah, I had a comment for the flat earthers. We all know that cats exist. Therefore, the earth can't be.
Oh, she broke up.
Be flat, or the cats would have pushed everything. Yeah.
Pushed everything off.
Am I back?
Right.
You're back. You want to try it again?
Looks like her.
Yeah. I'm getting some breakup here, and I'm not quite sure why.
I'm familiar with your joke. I think Howard might know it too. She said if the earth were flat and cats exist, given those two potentially true things, then cats would have pushed everything off of the earth over the
Actually, this is a good time to have that joke because my cat is banging desperately on the door wanting to get in here. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to open the door and let her come in. I'll be back in a second.
All right.
Our dog did something similar.
Yep. All right.
All right. My little thingy was getting all anxious. And it's bad when your thingy gets anxious.
It is. It is.
She'll probably visit with us for a little bit here. She loves to come up and be a Zoom star.
Oh, so good.
May see her. I didn't want her in here during the main speech because sometimes she can knock me off meetings by pushing the wrong combination of buttons. But here she is. Her name's Pandora.
Oh, nice. Okay, I saw Deb. You had your hand up. Did you have a question?
Well, your luck. I was so charmed by Rob's cats that I forgot what I was saying.
All right, Bapu, you have a question or a comment? Take yourself off mute, Bapu.
Yeah, my question was, when did the word secular become dirty? People ignored it for a long time, but when I came to this country in late 70s, It was literally, I felt that whenever I said, oh, I believe in secularism, and people looked at me very funnily. When did it happen?
Well, actually, it happened around that time with the rise of the religious right as a political movement. They began a campaign to just throw a lot of mud on that word, and they continued to do it. I have this magazine in my office put out by the American Family Association, which is a very aggressive religious right group based in Tupelo, Mississippi. And they had this magazine. They had a picture of a bulldozer, and it said, "Secularism, can it be stopped?" You know, implying that secularism is just like this bulldozer. It's going to flatten and destroy everything in its path. So very much something that they don't care for that idea.
Okay, thank you.
I want to tell you that there is a real afterlife membership. I have taken that some time ago. If you guys want it, go to ffrf.org and you can take afterlife membership.
Oh, nice. Nice to hear. I wonder if we can designate people as humanists after they die, sort of like the Mormon Church.
The Mormons, yeah.
No, if you take a membership in the American Humanist Association, you're a humanist, but they don't have an afterlife privilege. I don't think there is any membership in AHA, afterlife membership. Do you?
I don't think so.
Right. FFRF has done one for the sake of these guys who are worrying about afterlife.
I'd like to speak up as a member of AHA and also on the Executive Council for the Feminist Humanist Alliance. Anybody is welcome to give any donation, anytime, large or small. And I think that our alliance would be happy to designate you as a afterlife member, if that's what you'd like.
As Rob is aware, we do have different levels of giving. You can give if you wanted to do $5 or $10 a month. We have what's called the is it the Asimov? No,
sustaining.
Yes, it's a sustaining, but I'm blanking out on the name of the thing.
Well, it's all on the website. Yeah,
right.
They have different names for these levels.
Right. And we do have what amounts to a life membership. If you give $25,000, I think you can pretty much forget about having to pay dues on a yearly basis.
All right. Looks like Deb might have remembered her question.
I have a question.
Golly, I do.
Let's let Deb go first. She had her hand up earlier and she'd forgotten.
Thanks. I remember as regards humanism being given a bad name, I remember once having a positive interaction in a grocery store. I think Joanne was there too. We happened to see each other at the same grocery store and we were talking, and one woman said, approached us or something like that, and we were laughing, you know, and we said, maybe we were wearing our humanist t-shirts, and she said, oh, what's that? And my elevator speech was, humanism is whether you believe in God or not, or the other person believes in God or not, we should all treat each other well and take care of each other. And I got such a positive response to that by that woman, and it was great.
Good.
Great. Duncan, you had a question?
Yes, Rob. Is anybody challenging that CARE provision that allows churches to get loans and gifts for paying its clergy?
Well, you know, unfortunately, we're kind of afraid to. I mean, the Supreme Court has drifted so far to the right. And if you took that up, and you run the real possibility of creating bad law. So it's better right now to try to stop these things from getting into legislation. Now, obviously, in this case, it's too late, but there are other types of relief packages that are being looked at, and our lobbyists are doing what they can to keep out bad ideas. Another thing that they slipped into that original bill was money for private religious schools under the theory that, well, this is an unprecedented emergency and those schools need help too. So it's very discouraging, because obviously a piece of legislation of that size, I think that was what, $2 trillion. I'm sure there was a lot of good in there, but they did use it to slip in some things that are very dangerous.
I can understand an argument that would liken the payment for clergy, let's say, to allowing the fire department to put out a church fire. I mean, if the purpose of the legislation is to keep people employed and keep the economy going, is it reasonable? I don't mean to be the devil here, but I guess I am. Is it reasonable to separate religious organizations from the others that are benefiting from, from that kind of legislation?
I think so, because remember when I talked earlier about all the benefits religious groups already get, all the exemptions they already get, all the special treatment they already get. I think having received all of that, and then to tell them that they can get direct taxpayer support as well, that's just too much. I mean, the tradition in this country has been that religious organizations have been supported through voluntary donations given to them by people who believe in their mission. And in fact, there's been no problem keeping them going through those types of donations. If we open the door, I think, to widespread funding of religious entities, what concerns me is anytime something is deemed to be an emergency or just a serious problem, you can use that as an excuse to start funding religion. So if you had an area of the town, for example, where a lot of the buildings were blighted and run down, you could then rebuild churches because they're run down too if they happen to be. I just think we need to, as much as we can, keep the door closed on any type of direct tax funding of religious organizations. It's not our history. It's not our tradition.
Thank you.
Looks like John Farmer, you've got a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. I mean, churches already being supported by taxpayers, but anyone who donates get to write it off. Right?
Yeah,
they get a large contribution to your church, you write off, and that's money that don't go to the government's taxes.
They get a lot of indirect tax support already. And also think about the money that they get through so-called faith-based initiatives and other types of contracts they may be familiar with. In this country, a lot of social services are not run directly by the state. They are run by private actors that take taxpayer money and then provide the service on behalf of the government. And oftentimes that's religious entities. Now, they're not supposed to force religion onto anybody there or proselytize, but nobody really checks on that. So we get regular reports of abuses in that area.
Rob, I had a question, or I wanted to get your thoughts on something. I've got some friends who identify as conservative, and I've read some other conservative leaning writings. And one of the ideas I encounter is this idea that we should shrink government and stop things like gifts or support to foreign nations, support to social support for poor or underprivileged people, with the idea that private institutions or churches would fill that gap. And so I'm wondering if that kind of argument about cutting back on social services and direct aid for the government has some sort of ulterior motive of weakening government and empowering churches.
I actually think there's something to that. There's been some interesting studies of Western European nations. I mean, think about the Western European nations you're familiar with and how culturally secular they are, even if they may not be legally secular. They're culturally very secular, and the church attendance rates in many of those countries are plummeting. And scholars have wondered, well, why did that happen in those cultures? I mean, they're a lot like ours, but we didn't go through that. One theory is that in the post-World War II era, those nations built very strong social safety nets. So if you have a problem there, you really hit rock bottom, you lose your job or whatever, you're not just going to fall through one of the holes in that net. You'll be caught by it, you'll be helped, and the government provides that. In this country, we don't really have that type of a social safety net. We have a patchwork net, and it has a lot of holes in it, and people can just go right through those holes and end up in a really bad place. And in those situations, they are forced oftentimes to go to houses of worship for assistance. And of course, the houses of worship have an ulterior motive of wanting to bring these people into their fold to boost their members to proselytize. So the theory holds that if you build a strong secular state with a very strong social safety net, that disincentivizes people going to houses of worship, and as a result, their influence starts to wane. Now, that's not what conservatives want. They want strong houses of worship, and many of them at the same time want a very small government. So as much as they can push off onto private entities for social service provision, the better off for them. And I think, unfortunately, the worse it is for people because they just don't have many options of getting the help that they need.
Interesting. Thank you for your comments. Russell, did you have a question or comment?
Rob, you were saying how we should let people know that we have morals and secularism isn't bad, but it seems like there's so many of us that just cower in silence because we're surrounded by so many religious people. Are there any groups or organizations pushing like a movement for people to come out more or giving advice? Because that's something directly that we could control. Do you know of anything like that?
Well, there's Openly Secular, which encourages people to very openly declare themselves secular and come out of the closet, so to speak. The Freedom from Religion Foundation has advocated for that for a number of years, and certainly even the AHA and some of the other groups. Now, having said that, I want to make it clear to people that you need to do what is comfortable for you and what's safe for you. I live right now in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C., and it's a very progressive area. And by and large, when you tell people here that you're a skeptic of religion or you're an atheist or you're a humanist or you don't believe it, most people just shrug. It's not shocking to them. It's actually pretty common. I've run into people I've told that to, and they've said, "Oh yeah, well me too. I think that way." So not a problem in an area like this. But I come from Western Pennsylvania, which is 3 hours north of here. Extremely conservative area. Remember what James Carville said about Pennsylvania? It's Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Mississippi in the middle. Very conservative. So I would not be telling people up there to just be running around telling everybody they don't believe in God or you're a humanist, because there could actually be repercussions for that. You could get, they could find a way to retaliate against you. People have lost jobs, have been shut out, had people turn their backs on them. So everybody has to assess their own situation, determine what's safe for them to begin with, and then proceed from there. But I do think one of the things that we all kind of need to be working on is just having these conversations with people to the extent that they are safe to have, so that they will understand that a lot of what they have been told or what they have been led to believe about non-believers is not really accurate. Because that portrait has been painted of us by the fundamentalist Christians, and we need to kind of get that back and rewrite that definition as much as we can. Howard.
One of the organizations I would like to mention, and Rob's very familiar with it, is a group called the Clergy Project. And I don't know how many people here are familiar with it. These are people who who are clergy. They grew up in a religious environment. They went through a seminary. They've went out. Most of them have had congregations, and through the years have realized that what they see of the world and what they were brought up to believe aren't the same, and try then to, I don't know, come out, escape, leave the religious life. And some of them have had retaliation. Some of them have had spouses leave them. Some of them have had been fired from jobs because they've changed their mind. And we have been building through the Clergy Project for years a support network for these people, where if we can't help them directly, we're going to give them moral support. We're going to give them an ear to listen to. And there's been a lot of work within the secular movement helping these people to be able to transition back into a secular lifestyle.
Some of you may be familiar with Jerry DeWitt, who was a Pentecostal pastor, I think small town Louisiana, right, Howard? And he lost his faith. Right. And when he came out, he not only faced social ostracization, but just the challenge of making a living. I mean, imagine, this is what he had done his life. He preached, and you know, what else can you do from there in a small town where people are not going to hire you anyway? So that was a challenge for him.
You can go to work for a Unitarian Universalist church.
Yeah, or maybe be a salesman. You know, I think a lot of times I thought sales involves some of the same skills, but I don't know what Jerry wrote a book, and I'm not sure what he ended up doing, but it's a challenge for people, definitely, absolutely.
Jerry actually, I think his wife blocked him from even having visitation rights to his children.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I say you got to do what's safe for you, because I do know people in small towns and rural areas and where they've had threats of boycotts and had to deal with things like that, harassment. So it's first step is just know what you're dealing with and proceed from there.
Right. I know that it's later there on the East Coast compared to here. Rob, I'm happy to take questions as long as people are interested in chatting. However, I want to be respectful of your time, and if you'd like to wrap things up, just let me know.
Well, if there's any more, I'm happy to take them. It's a little about 10 o'clock here, so anybody else has anything they want to discuss?
Stephanie, did you have another question?
Yeah, I was really encouraged to see in yesterday's New York Times on the op-ed page the piece by academics entitled "The Demise of the Wall Between Church and State," talking about the problem of once unthinkable federal aid is now paying for clergy salaries. The writers were a professor from Cornell Law School and two professors from the University of Virginia Law School. And I was really glad to see that these scholars were analyzing the problem. I can understand why the strategy for our organizations, like Americans United for Separation of Church and State and AHA and Freedom from Religion Foundation, may not want to champion this now for fear of making bad law. But do you agree that it's really encouraging that the academics are paying attention to this?
Yeah, I thought that was an excellent piece, and if you haven't read it, it was published in the New York Times, and it's well worth your time to take a look at it. It's very helpful. That's one of the first sort of real serious examinations of this issue that I've seen. I mean, think about what we've been through lately with the coronavirus and now the incidents of police violence. A lot going on, really unprecedented in some ways. And it was easy for something like this to just not get attention, because for a while, as the pandemic was really raging, that was just the only thing that was being discussed in the media. So some of these things happened, and now later people are taking a little bit of a closer look at them. One more thing about this to remember about the courts. You know, I talk about the long-term gain and having a long-term strategy. That is important. With the courts right now, we could see, and I'm not here to speak in a partisan way because we're not a partisan organization. We're not allowed to be. We're tax exempt, and I know you are too. But depending on how things shake out in November, we could see changes on the Supreme Court, either in a very sort of, negative way, you might say, or a more positive way, because there's bound to be some more retirements. We were talking about justices that are they're at an age, a couple of them are just getting at the point where, they're just not realistically going to be able to stay on the court forever. So we can see change. And also remember that the Supreme Court accepts less than 2% of all the cases it is asked to hear. Less than 2%. So that means most of these cases are going to be decided by a lower court. And the Senate is responsible for advice and consent. So the president nominates a federal judge, and the Senate confirms or denies that judge. The House doesn't play a role. So the Senate is also extremely important. The makeup of the Senate is extremely important in determining what type of judges we get.
But we do have to counteract the fact that some of the other courts have already been packed too.
Yes.
So it's an uphill battle.
It is, but there are always retirements. There are always people leaving federal courts. There are always people who, for whatever reason, step down. So you just have to kind of remember that while that change can take a while, other times, if you're talking about a court that's closely divided, one or two appointments can shift it one way or the other. So yeah, it's a serious situation, but it doesn't have to be like this forever.
Right. Joanne, did you have a question, comment?
No, I had a comment. I got a phone call from Phyllis a couple of minutes ago. She's out of her surgery. She's back in her room and is quite lucid, and everything evidently went well.
Oh, great to hear. Thank you.
Excellent.
She's a trooper. All right, we'll be calling her soon. All right, anybody else have any?
Rob, John Spazzeri here. I don't have a camera.
Oh, hey, John.
You were talking about this group that was even into the 60s was trying to get the religion into the government.
Into the Constitution, yes.
Into the Constitution.
Yes.
Were they also trying to negate the rights that women had won over the course of the century?
That was actually a different organization. The Equal Rights Amendment, many of you may remember that struggle, was that the defeat of that was largely led by Phyllis Schlafly in the Eagle Forum. There are different religious right organizations that have come and gone over the years, and some of them focus on certain areas and others pick up different things. But Eagle Forum was largely known for its opposition to feminism and blocking the Equal Rights Amendment. So they weren't necessarily involved in any other issues. It's interesting. The situation with the attempt to add Christian language to the Constitution started in the late 19th century by this group I mentioned called the National Reform Association, but they didn't really survive far into the 20th century. So when it resurfaced in the early 1960s, it was, I think, largely a reaction to some of the Supreme Court rulings that were coming down during that time, dealing with issues like school prayer and religion in schools and things like that. And it was led by other activists and other individuals. Interestingly enough, some of you may remember Congressman John Anderson, who ran as an independent in 1980 for president. Yes. He introduced one of those Christian Nation amendments in the early 60s. Now he apologized for it later during the 80s when he was running for president. He said, I was a young man. It was a dumb thing to do. I wouldn't do it now. But in the early 60s, he introduced one of these in Congress.
You know, you were.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Rob, you were talking about the private expression of religious freedom. And that's something that I encounter occasionally when I'm talking to some of my conservative friends and associates, is this idea that we're so anti-religion that we want to, rip the crosses off of people's necks and burn down every church and whatnot. And I have to make it clear that I'm pro-freedom. I'm in favor of people believing and stating whatever they wish. Personally, if they're going to state it to me, I would like them to have a defensible position, and I would be happy to engage them in a dialogue about it. But I'm perfectly supporting of people's right for private expression. And I think that distinction in this larger social dialogue, that distinction between private expression and public or government-funded expression gets easily lost.
Right. Yeah, that's very important. Although I disagree with the theology of many of these groups, they're a right to spread it privately with their own money and their own initiative. That's 100% supported and protected, and as it should be. I live in a neighborhood where for some reason the Jehovah's Witnesses kind of come through pretty regularly. At least they were before the pandemic. And, sometimes I'd see them coming toward the house and I just kind of roll my eyes like, not again. But at the same time, I'm glad that they have the right to do that. That's religious freedom. They can come to my house. I can tell them I'm not interested. And if I wanted to go to their house and give them a copy of the Humanist and work a neighborhood and pass out that literature, I can do that too.
Well, we also have the opportunity to speak with them at the door or invite them into our home and have a rational dialogue with them. And I've found them to be quite open to listening. So if you want to take the time to entertain yourself in that way, you can.
Well, where I live, which is Silver Spring, Maryland, in our downtown area, there's a space that's kind of used for, community activities, and there's a farmer's market there, and a lot more activity before the coronavirus, but oftentimes there would be street preachers out there. And, sometimes you run a gamut. It's like there's a Christian fundamentalist street preacher, and then there was this splinter Islamic group that actually had very progressive views for Muslims. And then there was this really unusual group that I don't quite know what their name was, but they seem to have a lot of strange beliefs about Judaism and somehow connected to UFOs.
Yeah.
And they would have their literature there. And then one day I went down there and I saw this young man who he actually was evangelizing for atheism. He had some free thought literature and some signs. And I thought, well, this is great. This is America.
Right.
It's a free speech zone, and we've got these people putting out their messages, and some of them are believers and some of them aren't, and let them have at it.
Rob, if you ever get a chance to grab some literature from the UFO guy, I want to see that. But first of all, two things. One, as most people know, our past president, Rebecca Hale, used to call me the evangelical humanist. Because I carry pocket copies of the Humanist Manifesto with me constantly. Mm-hmm. And I even once got, while she was in the car when we were at Charleston, I even got a cabbie to start thinking about becoming a humanist. But right now with the pandemic, you are not going to get Jehovah's Witnesses, you're going to get Christian Scientists.
Oh, good point. Good point.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
Rob,
I'm going to go, but thanks everybody.
Rob, thank you very, very much for coming tonight.
My pleasure.
As always, you are a masterful speaker, and it's always very interesting to get a chance to listen to you talk about some of your favorite subjects.
Thanks, and some point in the future when we get back on the road, maybe we'll do it in person. Take care, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Rob.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Good night.
All right.
Okay. Before we close the room down, does anybody have anything they want to share about, or do people want to stick around a little bit and chat? I think when I leave, since it's I'm the room host, it might disappear.
Yeah, it'll go away. Mm-hmm.
So does anybody have any?
Good night, all.
Anybody have anything?
Can't think of anything.
Okay. Well, everybody, thank you very much for attending our inaugural Zoom meeting, and hopefully we won't have to do too many of these.
All right.
Bye.
Very well. Good job, Howard.
Thanks, everyone.
Fun.
Okay.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.
Stay safe.